Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. There's a lot of news about the Chinese Navy. They are taking out ships after ships. 22 ships in terms of their Coast Guard fleet was added recently, and the Chinese keep talking about their increasing naval capabilities. To make sense of the fog and to really understand what's happening, I have with me Vice Admiral Anup Singh, somebody I've actually depended on in the past few months to understand the entire paradigm of the Chinese Navy. Sir, thank you so much for coming to the show, and it's going to be wonderful listening and learning from you once again, sir.
Always a pleasure, Adi.
Sir, I want to talk about, a report that came out in the PLA Daily, and that was a bit of a shocker to me where it came out. I actually read it in the SEMP unexpectedly, and one vice captain of a ship actually turned out and said that, and I quote him, equipment waiting talent. Uh,
Mhm.
as a as a former naval, senior naval officer, and of course an expert in this field, what's your opinion, sir? What's happening in the Chinese Navy?
Actually, I'm not surprised by this report because, and apart from SCMP, even India Today covered it in December last year. Not surprised because, as I said in one of your shows a couple of months back or a couple of weeks back, that the one is to go back to the history, contemporary history, where when did the Chinese start doubling down on producing more ships and expanding their navy at a rate which has never ever been witnessed in modern times, not in the two world wars, not by the Germans, not by the British. They There is a record of sorts that in 2013 to 2014, 1 year period, they either launched, cut the first steel plate, or commissioned 64 vessels for the Navy and the Coast Guard in that 1 year period. Never happened in history. There is another record that they have broken about the number of ships that they have produced in the last 5 years. And that's why they are where they are insofar as numericals are concerned. And the Chinese, you look at them in any aspect of geoeconomics, in any aspect of maritime trade, merchant ships, container vessels, they something puts their thinking on fire to say, why is it that so and so shipping company or so and so country has produced a vessel which is carrying 20,000 containers? We will order one under the Chinese flag to have 20,100 containers. And that's what they've been doing. And lo and behold, early last year, they finally produced the largest in this competition of you win, I win. The largest container carrier is today owned by the Costco company of China, which is a public sector undertaking. Of course, they show it as private shares, public shares, and so on. Now, coming back to their navy, while you say 350 plus ships today as against 294 in the US Navy, but when it comes to technology and to the man behind the machine and man behind the gun, there cannot be comparison. Firstly, conscription in communist China is a completely different ballgame. It used to be 3 years in communist Soviet Union. It used to be 3 years, I think, in the Chinese and in China as well. But now it is 2 years. 90 days of training plus days of political Wi-Fi is full strength. I don't know why. Are you able to see my video throughout?
I am able to, sir, but you got cut off right at
Oh,
2 years, and then after that, if you can please repeat that, sir.
oh. So imagine what these conscripts go through. First of all, who are these conscripts? Where do they pick them up? Like we keep saying in India, because of our population and problems of unemployment, there's no dearth of manpower. So, irrespective of what kind of an offer comes, you will find 100,000 applications for 2,000 or 10,000 jobs, and that's how there's been such a stampede for Agniveers as well, and we have predicted this. No matter whether it is for 4 years or 3 years or 15 years, over there also there's no dearth of manpower. But because of the massive industrialization by the manufacturing shop floor of the world, as I call China, the largest manufacturing shop floor of the world in volume and value, the manpower which is easily picked by the armed forces, the PLA of all three wings of the PLA, is more from rural backgrounds and the poor families than from the educated class. So as I was saying that they've been, they've been picking up youth from poor rural families, and that's what happens in a society, in a community like this, in a society like this. Despite there being no dearth of manpower because of massive industrialization, when they started expanding their shipbuilding base in order to become number one country, which they did between 2007 and even now, they claim almost 37 to 40% of the world's shipping order book for merchant ships, and that's how they've been able to produce so many warships in the same shipyards. At least five or six major shipyards out of this entire lot are only concentrating on naval vessels. So when they started this massive industrialization about 25 years ago, in order to in order to expand the industrial base for exports, uh, even in skilled industries, like industries requiring very skilled manpower, like shipbuilding, etc. Can you imagine they picked up peasants? As it is, many farmlands had been converted into industries, as has been happening in many other countries, including some parts of India where the government has allowed certain alternate use of land for the sake of development and economic progress. But they did it on a very massive scale. Peasants who were already becoming poor by the day, with each passing day, because there was no need for certain crops to be sold in the market and there were no takers. And those guys were suffering. So therefore, they picked these guys up and put them into industries like shipbuilding, strategic industries like shipbuilding. That is why merchant ships used to vibrate. They were, despite being cheapest in the world, there were hardly any takers initially in the early part of this millennium. Despite being one fourth to one fifth the cost of ships made in, let's say, Holland or UK or elsewhere or Germany. Slowly they have improved because those same guys, they have finally started uh, streaming their children into the second generation and the third generation into the same industry, and therefore apprentice training has improved, and that's how their ships are becoming much better. Now, in a total of about 800,000 conscripts that they have for the three services, the Navy is the largest today. Yet they are short of manpower. But more importantly, it is amongst the sailors, that is non-officer class, the majority in these countries like the Soviet Union and even Russia today, and particularly China, the majority is conscripts. You cannot rely on a conscript which has gone through a training of 90 days plus 16 days of political indoctrination, overseen by the commissar, political commissar in every ship and in every headquarters. Even if he wears a rank junior to the commanding officer, he rules the roost. How can in those 2 years a man be depended upon? The Soviet Navy used to be notorious during the Cold War for having the largest number of incidents and accidents, including magazine fires, explosions, submarine sinking, ship sinking, because of conscripts. You cannot, and they used to have a 3-year sluzhba, as they call it in Russian language. Sluzhba meant conscription. Now, that is the first problem. The second problem is in the officer class. Because of the shock and awe that they received during Desert Shield, followed by Desert Storm, and thereafter a real solid shock in the third Taiwan Strait incident, when they found themselves to be totally incapable of planning or countering or trying to give some kind of response to the Americans who sailed through easily through the Taiwan Strait. And it was deterrence at its best, conventional deterrence at its best. The Chinese have gone great lengths in trying to trying to expand their navy, and they have done wonders. Now, when you do that and you do not have a plan to simultaneously produce the manpower, trained manpower, you're asking for trouble. Because today, through bot technology, after a cycle of almost 2 decades of reverse engineering, Soviet ships, Soviet aircraft, Soviet machines, they went into a very, very streamlined mode in their mind of buying technology from the West by enrolling their scientists, their engineers at 1.5 or 2 times, as the world says today, the Western world says, in terms of dollars. So those guys came and set up their strategic industry, their specialized industry, particularly war machine making industry. That's how they've come up to a stage where they have. Now, therefore, the situation is one of no envy to anyone. And the Chinese are suffering because they produced at such a high rate ships, aircraft, submarines in the Navy, and similarly other platforms in the Air Force and the Army. But they haven't been able to produce. They just did not think of investment in human resources. They did not realize what is involved in training officers, in producing that many officers. It's not easy. For example, we people also have been suffering shortage of trained, let us say, fighter pilots. Even the Navy, which has got a small Navy aviation wing, well, not very small, but compared to the Air Force, it is still small. I think we have today a total of some 300 plus aircraft of all kinds, out of which the fighters are the minimum, are the least amount. Yet, you know the cycle that is required for training a fighter pilot to be flying solo. At least 4 to 4.5 years, which includes basic training with the Air Force, and then now the Navy, Indian Navy, for example, has got its own AJTs. But before that, you have to go on a turboprop, a trainer, and then you graduate to a basic jet trainer. Now, like the Kirans, etc., produced by HAL, and then you go for flying on shore, from shore on aircraft which are meant to be flying from aircraft carriers. You get qualified with a trainer in a dual seat aircraft. Then you are, if he clears you after a particular number of sorties, it's a very elaborate process. And if the trainer clears you and you are cleared for deck landings, then you start doing deck landings. And only after that, you are allowed to do deck launches as well, takeoffs as well, from the ski jump or the catapult. We haven't got any more catapult aircraft carriers.
Hmm.
Hopefully,
Mm.
they'll come in the next few years. Now, this is a very serious problem, and that's why you imagine if I gave you an example of the Liaoning when she was commissioned in 2012 with great pomp and show. For the next 2 years, she was undergoing operational training of the carrier to be integrated into a naval aviation setup and its fleet. They just didn't realize what hit them that in that period of 2 years, they lost 8 pilots as of their own declaration for that for the modern Chinese aircraft, which has been modeled on reverse engineered from the Su-30 or Su-33. The Su-30 is the land-based version, and Su-33 is what operates from the Kuznetsov in the Soviet Union. Now, the Chinese started producing it and called it the J-15 after reverse engineering. Of course, they imported a lot of engines initially from the Soviet Union, from the Russians.
Russians.
They lost 8 aircraft, and the pilots could not eject in time. Now, all this is training in 2 years from the carrier, not from ashore. So, this is just one example. So it's not easy to say, and that brings me to another point. The art of carrier aviation is a different kettle of fish. You lose an aircraft carrier. For example, the Australians used to have a sister ship of the first Vikrant and called the HMAS Melbourne. In fact, incidentally, the Melbourne visited Bombay in 1977, and I saw both Vikrant and Melbourne sailing out of Bombay Harbour together, sister ships. And the Australians decided that we don't need an aircraft carrier, and we'll do with frigates and destroyers. And they are crying till today because from 1980, when they decommissioned HMAS Melbourne, 80 or 81, till this day, they've lost all the art, which is very critical to operate aircraft at sea, particularly fighters. So the advantage of power projection, which is the real requirement today, has been lost. Even though the Melbourne and the Vikrant, old Vikrant, were light aircraft carriers of just 19,000 tons full load and were meant for air defense of the fleet. But today's carriers, with the same pilots, with the same kind of training on modern machines, are supposed to do power projection. So the Chinese, are it's like saying learn to chew before you really gallop, and similarly, learn to walk before you want to run. They did not realize this. They produce machines because their economy allows them to afford doubling down at logarithmic rates of production. Those kinds of graphs have not been seen by anyone in the world because uh, money is not a problem for them. And they've just got one aim: we'll be the largest in the world, and therefore we'll be able to scare down everybody, including the Americans. It's not easy. That is the main reason.
That's a very interesting perspective. So, but I want to ask you, when something like this is the case, how does it play along with the seeming projection of professionalism that the Chinese naval forces want to do? And professionalism, as you've kind of explained right now, would be the key when you have long ocean forays. Uh, are we going to see a major Chinese accident sometime in the future?
Well, one hopes not with an Indian naval ship, nor in Indian Ocean, because that would be disastrous. And if at all they want to have accidents, they better do it in their own harbors or in their own, um, islands, etc. But there is a very serious problem of training resource imbalance in the Chinese Navy, particularly in the Navy. You imagine from Soviet era desktops, which were huge and bulky and produced so much heat with large valves like in the old radio sets in our homes. in the 50s and 60s, requiring enormous amount of air conditioning and slow moving machines on sine cosine generators, they have jumped straight away into solid state stuff, which is really ultra modern, either bought technology or, you know, third party acquisitions, and thereafter they have started to produce it in house. All these are cutting edge technologies, and they haven't got the manpower, even in the officer class. And when it comes to sailors, one of the weak areas in any navy which tries to become ultra modern overnight, the biggest challenge it faces is in professional sailors, operators of sensors in anti submarine warfare. Because it's easy for anyone to look at a radar which is looking into the air and try to detect aircraft before and missiles before ships. But anti submarine warfare is a completely different ballgame. And that's where you require professionals the most in a ship. When it comes to maintenance of equipment, then whether it is anti submarine warfare, or it is surface radars, or it is anti aircraft radars, or it is anti missile radars and anti missile SAM systems, self defense systems, and offensive missile systems, they are going to be nowhere, because it is not just anti submarine warfare, but these solid state cutting edge technologies that have been imbibed inducted by them, introduced by them, whether made in house or imported from somewhere, in the form of radars and screens and computer controlled, software controlled action information organization systems in operations rooms on ships and in submarines and in their aircraft, particularly on ships. You require well trained manpower. Conscripts can't be depended upon to look after things. What is 2 years? Nothing at all. In 2 years, a young sailor in the Chinese Navy operating in the Pacific would be more seasick um, on board a ship, even tied alongside in harbor, than in trying to understand things. So the majority of their manpower is all conscripts, and therefore this had to happen. But more importantly, even officer class, like this gentleman called Wang Yubin, who's as they call him, the vice captain of a Type 56056 corvette. A vice captain, I'm sure, must be the second in command or the executive officer, as the rest of the world calls its second in command on ships. Can you imagine? The second command of a ship is not only meant to be assisting the captain and is a standby if the captain gets incapacitated, or if there is an emergency, even in peacetime, if the captain is on shore and is not able to come on, has been sent on urgent leave or something. It is the second in command who takes charge of the ship and just sails out. Now he is not being assessed because his training was not complete. So that's why I said it's a training resource imbalance, a very serious issue. You cannot be permitting a second in command who's as good as a captain of the ship, because if the captain gets incapacitated, he takes charge. And many a time, superior authorities give an order that so and so sortie or so and so exercise will be. I would like to see the second in command taking charge of the entire operation, starting from casting off from alongside to to maneuvers at sea, to exercises at sea. How will he perform? And the second in command is the main link for coordination between other departments, that is, technical departments, but he's the overall coordinator in the ship. And he is supposed to be a role model before the captain, apart from the captain, who is the ultimate role model for his subordinates. So if he's not cleared the test because he's not cleared the training, how will others have confidence in him, and how will the subordinates look up to him to say this is how we must perform? But the system, the entire navy, cannot be trusting its ships with cutting edge technologies in every system when the man is not qualified. So
Yeah.
it's a very sad state of affairs. Now, since he is on type 056, again the same problem. They mass produced the type 056 in the last 10 years. And people were surprised. Three 056 corvettes coming out in a year, five coming out in a year. I think they produced a total of some 5 dozen of them before they handed over 5 or 10 of them into their Coast Guard. And therefore, they have a total of 50 or 55 in the Navy. They produced them faster than they could train and think of training their officers. So there are so many streams. The type 055, which is the ultimate destroyer, 10,000 ton. The type 052D, a real good destroyer. In all these, the problem will be the same as with Wang Yubin. God bless him, and hopefully he will clear the test soon. But it's a very telling story.
Hopefully he survives. So post this. I mean, that's the main thing. So recently, the Chinese actually put out news that they've taken out their aircraft carrier Liaoning into close to the waters in Guam, and they put out a video of some flight operations and this and that, and they called it a great leap forward in their naval technology and naval warfare ability. Now, to a layman, I've not, I'm not an expert, but a country that is ready for war is talking about taking its ship, what, 2,000 miles away and doing some flight operations and coming back as a great leap forward. It doesn't really make sense to me, sir. How do you look at it?
There is no leap in this. Vast. Second, she got commissioned in 2012. And I had forecast at that time in my presentations that by the year 2020, the Liaoning, along with her escorts, will make her first foray into the Indian Ocean. It hasn't happened. And why hasn't it happened? I mean, today, more than a decade has passed, 11th year of her commission. They are sending an odd conventional submarine in 2014 to dock into Colombo Harbor along with a tender, that is depot ship for support, because a conventional submarine cannot be remaining underwater for more than 20 odd hours if it is modern, otherwise even lesser. They sent an SSN after declaring it to 6 countries who operate in the Indian Ocean, including India, including America, including France, which operates submarines over here, and some other countries like Pakistan and Sri Lanka. And of course, nobody is supposed to see a nuclear submarine, but they announced it obviously with two things in mind. Firstly, to give a message, that tongue-in-cheek message that we have arrived now. This was in 2014, 13 December. And, like it or not, we are also operating submarines far away, nuclear-powered submarines far away from our shores. Second was an obvious thing, which was more clear, that they wanted to forewarn for their own safety, that look, we've been having a lot of glitches, and that's why we've not been operating our nuclear-powered submarines to the far seas. And should an incident or accident happen, don't blame us. So be forewarned. Uh, Strictly speaking, from the southernmost port of Hainan, which is a naval base, it is still about 5,000 nautical miles to come into the Arabian Sea, which is not an easy thing, because I must clarify this insofar as nuclear submarines are concerned, anywhere in the world. The one thing that really hurts a nuclear powered submarine and cannot keep it for longer underwater, as people think that for ages it can remain underwater, is the human factor. Uh, it is not that they get exhausted or claustrophobic in that environment. That, of course, is one of the reasons. But the most important reason is that at best you can keep human beings without sunlight for 40 days. The Americans have done a great job by keeping submarines for even longer, but at a maximum patrol of, I think, about 45 to 50 days, they get a submarine back in order to give relief to the crew. Um, so that is insofar as nuclear powered submarines are concerned. Similarly, the aircraft carrier, as I gave an example, for 11 years they've not been able to go get out of the Western Pacific. Now they've gone to Guam. Instead of 2,000 miles or 2,000 kilometers in their case, which is just about 1,400 miles, they can go 24,000 miles. To what avail? It doesn't impress anyone, certainly not the Americans. What will they do? You mean to say for 11 years they have been sitting on their haunches and trying to launch the aircraft carrier to that area? But they didn't get into the territorial waters because they'll go into harm's way. And there's no question of going into territorial waters. I mean, Americans would make mincemeat out of a guy who gets into their operating area. And the Americans are very tough for a long time when it comes to violating the bubble, as they call it, around the air bubble around an aircraft carrier of their own. They normally declare it, I think, about 200 nautical miles because their fighters, whether they are F-18s or whatever else, they have a capability to go to beyond 500 miles with full load and back after time on task. But 200 miles is the bubble which they declare that nobody should violate this bubble because you are asking for trouble for yourself. You can be intercepted because you are coming into harm's way insofar as our safety is concerned, safety of our air assets is concerned. So uh, there is no doubt the Americans don't want to create nuisance and trigger a unnecessary conflict or localized uh, crisis by carrying out any attack, but they won't allow these guys to come anywhere near the. I'm sure they have a proper ADIZ because of Anderson Air Force Base in Guam. Uh, Whether they are operating aircraft or not, they won't allow anyone. And Chinese dare not do anything of that sort. They'll be asking for such a serious trouble. The other thing is that Chinese have always been immature. You remember the EP3 incident in 2002 or 3, 2001 or 2, when the first incident of air incident collision to mid-air collision. I mean, it was inexcusable on the part of the Chinese. Of course, the guy, I'm sorry to use the word, he was an idiot. By coming close to the EP3, the American EP3, and deliberately coming so close that he finally unintentionally hit his wing. You don't do these things in the air. You will still survive if it happens at sea with a surface vessel, but certainly not in the air. I mean, you don't do it over land, certainly not over the sea, but anywhere. You don't even fly in that close quarter situation where air turbulence will make one of the two aircraft unstable. And the Chinese lost the pilot. Then, of course, you remember they launched two aircraft to format upon that EP3 and forced him to land on Hainan or wherever. And then they tried to, thereafter, I think the American president had to apologize after about 20 days had passed, and that's how they got the crew back and the aircraft back. But the Chinese were totally immature. They did something similar about a month ago. Again in the Pacific, they came close to a U.S. Aircraft. So they're going close to Guam, and what are they doing? They're showing their flag. Strictly speaking, the Americans, the kind of power they've got, including strategic bombers, which are not required for scaring anybody. All they have to do is to make a clear warning on open radio channels to this aircraft carrier group, Liaoning group, to say, keep off, this bubble, otherwise, you are liable to get intercepted and the fault will be yours. So, if any Chinese aircraft taking off from the Liaoning comes into that ADIZ, somebody or the other will take off from the Anderson Air Base and format upon and force him to land into their airfield.
Sorry, it's
Another
interesting.
part of another part of since your first question led to this second question, another example is the incident of the Chinese in UN peacekeeping mission in Sudan, I think 2015 or 16, when they, when the crisis erupted, they ran away from the battlefield. No army is known to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
So they are, first of all, they are formed or made up of conscripts who are not fully trained, a majority part. And you can't be sending conscripts just because it is a UN peacekeeping mission. You think that there is not going to be war. It can be worse, with the local militia or if there is civil unrest. You have to have properly trained people. And this is where they really, I mean, that was quite a showdown for them. Then in 2019, the World Military Games that took place in Wuhan, like we had, uh, I think, Commonwealth Military Games sometime in um, the first decade of this century, of this millennium. They were caught in the military games, not war games. The Chinese team in their own country, because it happened in Wuhan, if I recall correctly, in 2019,
19.
they were caught cheating, and therefore the team was disqualified in their own country, hosting the World Military Games. So that's what the Chinese military is made up of. You are concentrating only in political indoctrination as a capsule toward the end of your professional training, and professional training has not got upgraded and not keeping abreast of induction of cutting edge technologies. You're asking for trouble.
So another telltale sign that came out was the hiring of these Western pilots to train the Chinese, flight crews and stuff like that. And there was another report in SEMP that came out that said that young pilots, just a month out of training school, were going to intercept American aircraft. Now, that either is over enthusiasm or, I'm sorry, but over stupidity. Because,
It
I mean,
is it is it is the
when I,
latter.
when I
Stupidity.
told, yeah, when I told this to my dad, who's a pilot himself, he said, "यार वो तो fully ops भी नहीं होगा, ये कहाँ जा? What are they doing?"
Absolutely. Absolutely. They are not even half baked. And that's where the Chinese military establishment has been committing blunders after blunders. I gave you the example of the EP3. Nobody does this. You can't come so close as to cause trouble to yourself, and therefore he died. He didn't have enough warning to even eject himself from his aircraft. The EP3, being a large enough turboprop aircraft, survived with a damage to one of its wings and landed when he was asked by the Chinese, even though he was not violating any international maritime law or airspace law.
But the one thing about the Chinese maritime power, so that is something to be reckoned with, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the firepower. They've
Yeah,
been able to get their rockets, they've been able to get their rocket systems and a whole lot of other things, and which is a proven technology. They've been going up in space pretty successfully. Uh, you can't hide space incidents; it's not possible. And their
true.
their displays of firepower has been pretty decent. A lot of people actually criticized the way they displayed the firepower during the Nancy Pelosi's visit because it was not very well aimed and it fell
Yes,
onto Japanese islands and this and that and the other. Having said that, they do have the capability of projecting good firepower. So, how do you look at that with the susceptibility of, uh, you know, an opposition to China who's probably approaching that place with a large fleet? with anti-ship missiles and this and that. So that's one advantage that I look at the Chinese have. Sir. How do you kind of analyze this?
No doubt. Once again, they reverse engineered a lot of missiles from the Soviet system,
Yeah.
and then in after the Gulf War, they suddenly realized that they are living a vintage navy with vintage weapons, and antiquity will not serve them neither in range nor in. They were all sub Mach 1 missiles, um, and were not really sea skimmers insofar as the navy was concerned. Um, Now, for example, they've got those long range CJ series, CJ 20, um, ALCMs, and they've got anti ship missiles of the YJ series. Some of these are multi Mach, and now they've proved, they say that hypersonic glide vessel technology into missiles. And that is once again multiples of Mach 1. So, therefore, detection and interception is completely ruled out. Um, in these, there is no doubt that they are mass produced and they've gone and far away from the Soviet technology followed by Russian technology. And they've, uh, even though the basic missiles were designed on Russian systems, they have brought in those engineers and scientists, etc., to design to firstly train the trainers in their own navy and air force and in their strategic rocket system. Um, Secondly, mass produce these missiles, and they are give the due to the devil. I think they have done well once again on the backbone being economy, of which there is no dearth at all in that country. And it's a single window system. The order comes from just one man, and there are no need, no second thoughts on budgetary allocations. Where else is the priority required for an $18 trillion economy? That's no problem at all.
So that
So
is a threat.
there is once again the man behind the gun and the man behind the machine is more important. If they haven't got trained manpower,
Yeah.
you still have to go through certain methods in every kind of missile, no matter how modern it is, before you carry out a firing, before you carry out a firing in actual crisis, because a mistake could mean blue on blue, friendly fire. A mistake could also mean violating international law of armed conflict. For example, striking down a commercial aircraft,
Yeah.
a merchant vessel, creating marine pollution by hitting a tanker, which would be unthinkable. So all this requires a lot of training because it is finally no amount of AI is going to help any navy insofar as that part is concerned. There it is human intelligence more than simple check off lists hung around their necks with where they say, all right, checklist serial one, press so and so button without like zombies. You can't do that.
I think that's a very telling statement that you put across, and that's a very telling interview, if I may say so. So, because uh, the problem is that we look at these shiny new crafts and we all get impressed, and we all look at our navy and say, "यार हमारे पास क्यों नहीं है?"
Mm.
Uh, we should also mass produce, and we should also do this and that and the other. Of course, you've brought out certain points that these, if I may transpose what you said, that naval warfare is a tradition which is honed over time. It cannot be just switched on. It's not something that you just produce a ship, put 50 guys into it, and chalo bhai, shuru ho jao. It's not
Absolutely.
possible. So that's
Like I said, the art of carrier aviation, thank God we did not have a single gap since 1961 insofar as aircraft carriers are concerned. And we deliberately stretched and overstretched the life of Virat whose total life was forecast to be just predicted by the British also to be just about 5 or 7 years after we bought the Hermes from them, which had taken part as a helicopter carrier in the Falklands War. And we did a year-long refit over there with our own concepts to say ski jump must positively be there, and um, bringing her back to operations because she was in cold storage after the just a year after the Falklands War, and we stretched her. In 1987, she arrived in India. 5 years was the given time, and we stretched her till just about, I think, 5 years ago, we decommissioned her. So you imagine refits after refits, all by ourselves, just to make sure, because there was only one carrier, old or new, doesn't matter. You have to keep the art of carrier aviation going.
I mean, for the lack of a better word, and I've heard this out of movies, landing on a matchbox in the middle of the ocean is not easy. Um,
That's right.
so one can actually just, it's a lighter statement, but there's a lot of depth in it actually when you think about it. I mean, something which is pitching, landing in a normal runway is difficult. Pitching and yawing and in the middle of the night, it's going to be impossible. Sir, thank you so much. It's always a learning experience when I talk to you, and I hope to have many more interactions in the future to kind of analyze, especially naval warfare and naval traditions. And of course, as our Navy also grows, probably we can talk about that as well, sir. It's, as I said, wonderful talking to you and looking forward for the next show on another interesting subject. Till then, sir, Jai Hind.
Jen, thank you. Always a pleasure, Adi. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir.